Hi everybody. We're 2 minutes early, just a minute and a half early. Just getting everybody set up for the August Quilts First. We have so many great questions that you've sent on our social media pages. So I hope you'll, if you're eating lunch or have a drink, cold drink, you can join us because I think this is a really interesting topic. And the topic is getting unstuck. So we'll be discussing how we deal with overcoming barriers.
It's a very common thing. And I think for quilters, getting stuck can mean so many things. It can be stuck with color palettes. It can be stuck in a rut of either not having the energy for the next project or being torn in multiple directions. So we'll kind of go through.
Or just like not knowing how to move forward. You're stuck. And this is one of the things in our teaching that we really, hi Robin, that we really try to focus on is giving you tools that will help you, even if it's not a project related to us, that will help you grow as a quilter and know what to do when you find yourself uncertain about a palette or a project, or even just losing your quilt mojo, as some people have asked us about.
And it's something that happens to all of us. I mean, we have been designing and making quilts together for not just
even know?
It really, I'm going to say it's been 27 years that we have made quilts together. So there are absolutely times when you sit there and you think like, it's kind of the equivalent of writer's block, but we'll share how we get through things.
Yeah. Susan's here. Hi, Susan. Okay, so we're going to just dive in to the general topic and about getting unstuck and share some of the questions we've already gotten. Feel free to add questions in the chat and we will get to them. We'll kind of put them in, mix them in.
Weave them into conversation.
Yes, exactly. Yes. I think one of the first things that I want to say on this topic is that I said this in my Craftsy class, 10 years ago, but I think if you want to have creativity in your life, you need three things. You need a place to be creative, space in your head to be creative, and space in your day to be creative. And I think when you're feeling stuck with something, I think one of those is often that's to me like the first checkpoint that I think you should pass.
Right. I think very often people jump to, there's a problem with this quilt. And I think Weeks's suggestion, I guess, is that back up and make sure you have that space in your life, in your day, in your home, because often if one of those is constricted, it becomes a barrier that you're often not even aware of.
I don't know what Karen's question is. What are you on? I don't know what that means. Not on anything. But I think the idea is that sometimes if you're like, somebody was asking about reclaiming your sewing and piecing mojo, that how do we deal with it when we're just, you feel like you've lost your mojo? And I think for me, I don't have space in my head for something else right now. And that is sometimes what affects it, or I'm just tired. But I think it's absolutely, and this is kind of controversial, I think, but I'm a big believer in not every quilt needs to be finished. Not every project needs to be finished. I think sometimes that project has taught you what you need to know. Mm-hmm. And I have donated, there was like a needlepoint kit that I started like 10 or 15 years ago. And no, it was more like 30 years ago actually. And my taste had changed and I just gave it to a resale shop along with the yarn because I thought somebody would love to finish this, and I've done half of it. but I don't want to dedicate that much more time to it.
Yeah.
So, and I think that that's a really positive mental health thing to do, to say, I've learned as much as I need to learn from. If it's a particular quilt, ask yourself, why is it you don't like it anymore? You don't have time for it anymore. You've developed, you've got an injury in your hands and it doesn't work for you anymore. You don't have to finish everything.
No, and I think that's, we're very process oriented, but I think there can feel like a lot of pressure sometimes. You've spent money for fabric, you've thought long and hard about it, and it can feel like pressure that if you don't finish the quilt, you've somehow let yourself or someone else down.
Yeah.
And for me, it's, I have no problem starting a book, not liking it, and just returning it to the library. I don't feel a need to finish every book. And I think similarly with quilts, UFOs can become a problem if there are too many of them. But I think, if you're a serial non-finisher, you might ask yourself why at times, if that is a problem.
If it's
not a problem and you're just enjoying new techniques and new color combinations, that's absolutely okay.
So, and we don't usually use these live streams to heavily promote things, but I will say this publication, Rediscovering Your Stash, is, I think, really invaluable on this topic, because in our tens of thousands of students, both online and in person, that we've taught over the years, I know from talking to some people that some people lose their mojo because their sewing space is cluttered or crowded or feels out of control, or they feel overwhelmed. And sometimes I've heard people say that they get more done at a retreat because they don't have to look at everything that they don't have a whole bunch of unfinished business staring them at the face.
They had to pack. They had to make certain decisions to pack, and they've limited the options, the distractions. And,
So and this is just me, it might not be helpful to you, but I'm gonna just throw it out there. I would take a really hard look at the space, if you're the space in your stash and everything, and determine whether the environment that you've set up for yourself is, I've heard people say, I don't want to go into my sewing room because it's chaotic. And if that's the case, and this isn't me being like,
it's not a judgment.
Nick, it's not a judgment. It's ask yourself, if the goal of having a sewing space, even if it's a temporary space on your kitchen table, is that that's a place that facilitates your creativity. And sometimes having a bigger space just means that there's more that can get out of control. It's people always look at our large studio and they think, oh, I'd love to have something that size. And I always think, like, you have to really, even with a big studio, if it's not organized, and if it feels like there's a bunch of unfinished projects, that can really discourage and kind of sap our creativity.
Yeah, I think we try. She says we have a large studio. It's all relative. We have students who have much larger studios. We have people whose studio is the kitchen table, and you have to figure out how can you make the space you have work for you the best possible and as best as possible. And I think that we do fairly periodic cleanups and
regular cleanups, and purging.
After every project, we kind of refile fabrics. Every night, we put all the tools away. Yeah. And part of that is just because when you have two people working, it's
sometimes three people
or more people working, you have to have a shared space that everyone understands and is comfortable in. But I would absolutely encourage you to ask yourself if it's a space issue for you and how you can deal with that.
Or an organization issue. And sometimes I think that there is a method of a thought, a perspective, I guess I should say, which is like, I need more storage containers. And sometimes you just need fewer fabrics. You need fabrics that you love. And the Rediscovering Your Stash publication is all about being honest with yourself about whether you're holding on to fabrics in your stash because you feel guilty that you bought them and you put a lot of money into them, and you feel like you can't get rid of them as a result of that. But sometimes letting go, sometimes having fewer fabrics that you love is much more, it's much better for your creativity than having more fabric.
Yeah.
And this is somebody who's a fabric designer.
It's an individual thing.
Yeah.
But,
so,
and then I think, we said, so that's kind of space in literal physical space, but space in your head. For some people, quilting is the escape, and they can set aside other things that are weighing on them. But in some cases, you have to just tidy up certain aspects of your life to feel free and creative.
And carve out time. I think I have made the mistake in the past with certain tasks in my life where I've put them off, and I'm thinking of one like right now that I just need to work on it tonight. I just need to work on it tonight. And I keep telling myself I need a big chunk of time to do it, and I don't. I need like 5 nights of 30 minutes, set a timer. It's something I've been procrastinating on, which is not normally something I do, just because it's complicated. But one of the ways I think to, tackle any task that's difficult or that's your least favorite part of the process is to do it in small chunks. And then you just feel like you're making progress. You're just pushing the nut along so you can get to the part that really feeds you more creatively.
And I think, watching the summer camp mystery quilt that we just did, I really think part of the joy came from the weekly installments and people being able to enjoy the process and making little blocks they loved, even though they had no idea where it was going.
Well, some people said that not knowing where it was going
helps.
Yeah, that actually, yeah.
So, maybe a mystery quilt is a good thing for people who are blocked.
But I think the other part of it is to ask yourself, if you've lost your sewing and piecing mojo, what is it that you need to get it back? And I think some people get overwhelmed by big projects and that, scale it down, decide you're going to do a bunch of baby quilts for charity or, friends who are having babies or whatever, and have easily finishable, achievable goals for yourself. And, there are lots of people who do the 5 gazillion piece quilts that they spend 3 years on. I don't have an interest in that, and I feel like
if it works for you,
yeah,
great, but...
if that's choose what's motivating for you, and don't decide that you see something at a guild show or whatever, and you think, oh, I need to do the Dear Jane quilt or some, 85-page paper pieced thing with all these intricate pieces or applique or whatever, or something that needs to be hand quilted when you've got issues with your hands. Choose something that's achievable that you can finish and feel good about.
And that, I also think the motivating factor sometimes is a deadline, a shower of some sort you have to go to. Sometimes it's just reconnecting with old fabric, saying, I'm only using my stash, or I want to make a blue quilt. And you don't know what that's going to be, but you can shake up how you work on a project. There's some people who always start with a pattern. They fall in love with a pattern, then they find the fabrics. There are others who start with the fabrics and then say, what can I do with these fabrics? Now, if you tend to always work in one way, maybe you try to switch that up. I mean, for some people that works, for some it doesn't.
I love Kathy Joyce Fulmer's comment here that she needed the reminder to do things in small chunks. I've been stuck in thinking that I have to take care of all the things in my life and work first, and this is actually counterproductive for me. That's counterproductive for everybody. And this is such a gender thing for many women I know who feel like, and I am guilty of this as well, I have to make sure the person's birthday present is purchased, the thing for the bake sale is made, the house is clean, the garden is weeded, and then at some point I'll do something for me. And whereas deciding that you would feel better, and there are so many times that I've said to Bill, for me, sometimes it's the garden too, that I really want time in the garden and I've got a lot of deadlines and I'm like, I just need 30 minutes of weeding and I'll just feel better. It's just, that's what my mental health needs. So I think the smaller chunks also may feel more achievable for you in terms of scheduling, but I think it's really helpful to not think I need to set aside a day to do something. I need to set aside half of a day to do something and say, can I do something for 30 minutes after dinner instead of scrolling through?
Yeah, if you get carried away and spend 2 hours, great. But
yeah, exactly.
Start with a manageable chunk. And I think we have to do that too in terms of... I'm a therapist, so I know better. Yeah, they're just cobbler's children, right? But for me, one of the challenges when we talk about getting unstuck is that this is our work. And when you put creativity and work together, that can be tricky too.
Be creative.
Yeah.
Be creative.
You will never see me on a reality TV show where someone's like, okay, you have 2 hours. I would flail. I'd be the first person sent home. And
that's not true.
Yeah, I'm a percolator. And so creativity, for some people, they need that scheduled time. For others, I think it's just setting aside time.
Yeah. So, and there's some of the other questions that we've gotten about this are kind of related to this. So I think all this is going to tie together really nicely. Someone was asking about the courage to do her own quilting. Like, how does she summon up the courage to do her own quilting? And that also is one of these, I think in your head, it's this big monumental, like, how do I run a marathon? And the answer is that you do it in bits, and you set interim goals for yourself. And one of those things could be to don't think about quilting quilts. Think about developing a stitching library for yourself that is forgiving. Mm-hmm. You're not going to start learning how to quilt on a quilt. You're going to be practicing on some pieces that don't have the pressure of a finished quilt. So do you want to share?
We do this all the time.
What we do?
Sometimes we do it for textures. Here's a good example. This is some labyrinth quilting, which is all freehand quilting, which is kind of square spirals that interconnect. And when we were trying this, we just wanted to get a sense of density, and we even tried it super tight, which is awful feeling to me. Like, I wouldn't want a quilt that I curled up with this because it's just too stiff.
It would do really well in a quilt show.
Yeah, judges like this stuff. Yeah. It's not my thing.
Yeah.
But it was really good to see just how the material behaves.
With the batting we had.
Yeah, but we do, even here, just kind of having a spiral versus a square side by side. And we do lots of these pieces that sometimes we use them before doing a big quilt just to kind of warm up and get the sense of density and
To just
kind of refresh the muscle
practice.
memory. But it's also good because like I have a terrible memory and we've made a lot of quilts. And if you make, like we do, lots of these and stack them up, sometimes you have a quilt and you're like, how am I going to quilt this? And we just pull out the stack of samples. Not saying that it has to be one of those, but it's a great refresher and a reminder.
Yeah.
And I think that I also want to say something else about this though. The quilting, when people are trying to learn to quilt and quilt their own quilts, there's the piecing and there's the quilting, but then there's the overall final product. And I think because people go to quilt shows and they see prizes for quilting, they put more pressure on. I mean, a lot of quilts, if they're quilts you're going to use, the piecing is the most noticeable thing in many quilts. And I think if you have a nice texture and a nice drape, quilting is way more forgiving than people think it is.
And thread color and all of that. And I think Kathy Joyce Fulmer, the therapist, will support me when I say this. I think it's really important that we not, it's so hard to say because I know in the quilting community, competitions and shows are just so important to them, and I don't want to be taking anything away from that. But the judging and the self-criticism and the comparing yourself to other people who may have been doing this full-time for 30 years, it's really important that you allow yourself to learn and be forgiving to yourself, that it takes time to learn. And it's like, how do I have the courage to do your own quilting? You have the courage to do your own quilting because you decide that learning is a good thing, and that you're not gonna judge yourself, and you're just gonna learn something new.
Yeah,
and allow yourself to be a beginner.
And a comparison thing, there are people who quilt because they want to be expert quilters. And there are people who quilt because they want to use their quilt and they want to finish it. And that is absolutely okay. I don't know how many hundreds of quilts I've quilted. I almost never sit there looking at the quilting when a quilt's done. To me, it's just part of the feel of it. It's like I
think you're alone though.
I don't dissect it. I just like the quilt. So
yeah.
So I don't know. I think be more forgiving.
Yeah, I think that. I'm glad she agreed with my statement. Placemats are great. Charity quilts, dog quilts. There are, local shelters have sometimes need for doggy beds. There's all kinds of things you can do. But I think the most important part of summoning up the courage to do your own quilting is in your head, and deciding that you're going to learn and you're going to progress and you're going to have faith that with time you'll get better, and with practice you'll get better. And for those of you who don't know, I was in a car accident, 2 car accidents, unfortunately a month apart, 3 years ago, and I lost the ability to use our long arm quilting machine for 2.5 years, and it made me dizzy and it made me nauseated. So I had to start from scratch.
And you had to do a lot of vision therapy.
I had to go to vision therapy, and I had to do exercises like 5 times a day. So I am sympathetic to that, the fear of you don't want to mess up your quilt, especially when you've been doing this full time. But, I started back and I worked with the vision therapist, vision therapist, and and I started doing it for 5 minutes at a time because that's all I could tolerate with the concussion and the injury I had to my vision. So I started it with 5 minutes at a time, and I'd work my way up to like 15 minutes, and I couldn't sew for 6 months. So I am just a real big believer that you set small achievable goals for yourself. You decide that wherever you end up is good enough, and that you take a lot of pressure off yourself, because it's really, you can really get in your head and like, well, this isn't what it's supposed to look like. And it's like, well,
we also talk a lot in quilting about the irregularity, similar to handwriting. When you work on a small area, it's easy to identify what you consider the flaws or the irregularities. But then when you have a couple square feet of that, it all tends to blend together. And there's a comment from Gina about walking foot quilting is great. I totally agree with that. I think straight lines are so underrated.
Well, you can do curved lines with walking.
You can do curved lines with the walking foot too, but just like the walking foot is a great tool.
And I think I understand what Diane's saying about she wants like what I hear you saying is that you want your quilting to be at the same level of your piecing, and that's totally understandable. But I think you have to like step back and say, how many years did it take me to get to that level of piecing? And then you're going to need some time to get to that level for your quilting as well. So maybe think of them as two separate skills that will meet it in the future, but you may need to work your way up to that.
And if you're a goal setter, that's a great thing to do. So we happen to have a situation that when we want really free form, freehand or free motion quilting done, Weeks is the person. It's not something I aspire to be great at. It's not my strength. While she was kind of working on her therapy to recover, we just didn't do that on any quilts because
I couldn't do it.
She couldn't do it.
Sorry,
it wasn't
not
something
option.
that interested. I thought like I'll wait for her. I've got lots of other ways I quilt.
Yeah.
And so, identifying and being very open and clear with what do you care about, what do you want to invest in,
and what can you do, what's manageable for you, because for some people the quilting part of it is just like big quilts on a domestic machine are tricky to do. That's just it's just the physical, the thing over your shoulder awkward. And so there are lots of ways to make it easier for yourself. And I would say if you want to improve your quilting, start small and do it frequently and do it where there's nothing at stake. Do not start
try
on
some samples.
Samples. Do not start it on a pieced quilt.
Or the placemat suggestion was also.
That's also good.
We use placemats all the time and
every day.
They're great.
So another person asked about expanding her palette. Actually, I think this is the same person, to not always revert to similar saturations and hues. And that, I think, is one of the tricks that I would suggest, is that you make a quilt for somebody else with colors of their choosing, because that will really force you to work with a different palette.
We've done a lot of commissions over the years, and I'd say 80% of the commissions, there are certain constraints on color. And sometimes we're given a very tight palette to work within. Sometimes we're given the constraint that the client hates orange, no orange. It can go in all different directions, but I would say every single time we've done a commission with some sort of color constraint, I've enjoyed it. Even if it hasn't been a palette that I would gravitate towards naturally, I'm a big believer that there are no bad colors. There might be less good uses of colors, but I love that challenge. I think that's a great one.
Barb's question about if you're quilting on a domestic machine, do you recommend doing it in sections or chunks or back and forth all over? I think if you're doing it for the first time, if you look on our Hello Baby YouTube tutorial, that was filmed 6 months after my car accidents. That was the first thing I sewed after the car accidents. And it was a baby quilt for a cousin of mine. And I did a simple wave pattern on a domestic machine for a 30 by 40 baby quilt. And that would be this exactly what I would start with. If you've never quilted on a domestic machine, you can do it with a walking foot or without, it doesn't really matter. But I mean, it's obviously, if you've got a walking foot, use it. But that is a simple technique that you can do on a domestic machine. And you're starting, in that case, you start, I think I started on one end. Yeah, I think I started on the end. If you're doing, typically people who do free motion quilting on a domestic machine or dropping their feed dogs or whatever, usually they're starting in the middle so you can distribute the fabric evenly and you don't end up with a bubble in the middle. If you're doing the waves, I'm pretty sure I started it, maybe I started it in the middle.
Usually with the waves, I start in the middle and move to one
you
edge.
Do one side, roll it in the other direction, and then, I think we started in the middle.
But the whole question of chunks, if you have a larger quilt, even if you've been quilting for a long time, this is very unpopular advice, but spend a little longer basting a bit more densely.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Or use the
I have
spray base.
never, ever heard anyone say their favorite part of quilting was basting. It's just like, it's usually just kind of an annoying step that gets you to where you want to go. And I've seen many basted quilts that I feel like if you had spent 2 more hours basting, everything would have been a little more stable. You wouldn't be fighting wrinkles and puckers. And yeah, that's not fun. But
I'm going to disagree with you and say I think I've basted my last quilt in terms of basting. I think I would be going for the Oda 505.
Oh, the adhesive,
spray base.
washable.
Yeah, because it doesn't come up. That's the only one I would use. It doesn't come up your needle. And I did that, I think, for the Hello Baby quilt. And it was just like hand basting. I thought that the Oda 505 was a better basting. It was faster, but it also just yielded a better, it just performed much better under the needle.
And one other thing that's an option, if you know someone who does long arming, some long armers will, for a small charge, baste your quilt. If you really want to quilt it yourself, they will put the backing, the batting, basically make the layers on their long arm and go over it and just do a very, cursory base that's easy to take out later, but is going to be, if you don't want any chemicals, you don't want to use an adhesive spray like the Oda 505, that is definitely an option.
The Oda 505 is odorless too, because if there's some that I've smelled that absolutely no, and there's some that gum up your machine, but that's the only one I would use. Mm-hmm. The pinning, the safety pins, that would be a hard no, never for me, just because it's hard on my hands, and but it's always whatever works for you.
Yeah. Okay,
but expanding your palette to not always... back to that.
Back to the... working with someone else's colors is... Yeah. And I think another thing that we've talked about in the last couple mystery quilts we've done is a lot of times people see a quilt or a pattern, they're like, I want to make that. I love greens, here are my greens. And if you step back when you see a pattern and try to analyze a little bit, what is the role of the colors? Like, are you trying to have soft edge, crisp contrast? And if you can try to articulate what's going on in those choices, it might push you away from your usual selections of fabrics, because rather than looking for a certain color, a favorite color, you're looking for to fill a role of color in that design.
But I also think that the narrative in our heads matters too. And I've so frequently heard people say, those are not my colors. And I think just not saying that, and or questioning that in your own mind when you hear that, you say like, well, those aren't my colors. And I think like, well, why are you limiting yourself? You know, is it you really don't like those colors, in which case you don't need to break out of them. But if you are wanting to not revert to your same palette over and over again and the same saturations and the same hues, I would sort of ask yourself why you have been doing that. And I think a lot of these questions that we get comes down to fear, that you don't want to make a mistake, you don't want to waste your money, and that will all in your time, and that's super understandable. But I think it comes down to maybe start small, maybe decide you're going to make some placemats in different colors, maybe decide you're going to make a little wall hanging in different colors. Any change in the behavior or your habits is always easier when you start small, because you'll feel that there's less at stake, and it's not going to feel like, well, I'll never do that again. You know, you don't have as much to lose. So if you're thinking like, oh, I want to make a queen size wedding quilt for somebody, and then you're sitting there thinking like, oh, do I really want to risk messing that up and wasting that money for colors? You know, the other thing, and again, I don't always push this, is look at some of our palettes of the month. That would be another way for you to like look in a series of a color combination, and try to make something with one of those little bundles, because we've already kind of curated the colors for you. And so that's what I would do. Okay. Creatively look at your stash and use it. I want to creatively look at my stash and use it. 100% the purpose of this publication. So do you want to talk, you want to add more about that?
Go ahead.
We developed this publication because the class we had that we used to teach in person was by far our most popular class, and the one that people said was life-changing for them. We developed the publication because we knew that there were lots of people who would never make it to the class. And I think if you were going to own one of our publications, this would be the one to me to own. Because if you have a stash issue, if your person doesn't have a stash, then that isn't useful. But do you have anything to add to that?
Just one of the things we've done over the years is we're always cutting fabric for customer orders. And I wish you could all kind of be flies on the wall at times, like, oh, these are beautiful fabrics together.
I sometimes post them.
Weeks post sometimes people, and we never know if someone orders 10 fabrics, are they using them together, or are they for 2 projects? But sometimes you just look at them and you think, I've never worked with this palette. This is inspiring. And so, and also sometimes we pull colors, and last year when we did our palettes of the month, that was really fun for us because we did that collaboratively, and we didn't have projects in mind. We were just creating inspiring bundles, thinking of how they could be used. But that's something else that, again, I think quilters are very, very often goal project oriented, but maybe just take a half hour and say, I'm going to pull 15 fabrics and put together a palette, and I don't even know if I'm going to make something with it. But there's kind of a joy in playing with fabric that way.
In the Rediscovering Your Stash class that I used to teach, I had something called the Fabric Smackdown, in which I would have people bring up to the front fabrics that they didn't know how to use, and I would pair them up with somebody else, and they would have to figure out how to use them together in the same palette. And that was an extremely helpful way to force people out of their go-to palette because they had to work with somebody else's fabric. So you could certainly maybe get together with a friend and see whether you are going to try to pull a palette together. But that's never time wasted.
Yeah.
Trying to look at colors that you don't use and try to figure out, is there some way to integrate this in? The question,
I just saw Shelley's another ODIF 505 testimonial. It's good stuff.
Lori's question about adding neutrals to a scrappy palette with pleasing results. I think neutrals are, they are a way to add dimension, that when you have everything that's the same level of saturation or the same hues or whatever, and you have something that's different in there that's more desaturated, which is what a neutral is, it gives you depth. It's kind of like, you could have, if you're cooking a dish that's, let's say you're cooking a cake, sometimes having, a little bit of salt or a little bit of something else in it is going to give the flavor profile a little bit more depth. And it's the same thing with neutrals, that when everything is the same hue, the same saturation, it feels kind of shallow in terms of interest. Whereas when you add something that's desaturated to it, it becomes just a little bit more interesting. And we always credit Kay Fassett with, he's the master in his fabrics. If you have some in your stash, or if you are in a store and look at them, the ones that he does in particular have a combination of very, very bright and dusty, muddy as well. So he'll have magenta, like a neon magenta next
With
to an
ochre,
olive green or ochre or something like that.
And specifically, if you're looking at them, he's got his collective. There are different designers who design in that collective, and I would, concentrate on the ones that he's done.
Yeah, or also Philip Mabley. But as I understand it from talking to him, he does all the color work, or at least he used to. I don't know if he still does. Everybody presents in the collective, presents them sketches in black and white, illustrations, and then he, assigns colors to them. But he's really great at not doing kind of a cotton candy sort of approach where everything is, bright or pastel,
Which can get very saccharine.
Yeah, but the idea is that when you mix in, I think people just think so much in terms of hue, and they don't think in terms of saturation or value. And by having different levels of saturation in a fabric or in a quilt, you're giving it additional depth.
But I think those neutrals are a way to, we're talking about getting
okay.
unstuck, and I think they can help you get unstuck.
Yeah.
Okay, more questions.
So this is such an interesting topic. How do you know when to cut your losses? I don't know. Let me know when you figure it out.
Yeah, that's.
I think when either you're tired of storing it because it's been sitting there for a long time, or you have a bad association with it. But having said that, our United States of Green, that was a UFO for 7 years before I figured out
what to do with it.
And that's the only time I've ever had a UFO that sat around for that long. But I was still excited about it. So if you're still excited about it, but you just don't know where you're going with it, that's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
We have just straight up given away unfinished quilts on, partially pieced things that were just, there's just no chance you're ever going to like it. That you made it for some other reason. It was a different time in your life. It just doesn't feel good to work on it. Then you're done.
And I think that kind of when to cut your losses can be at many stages. It can be when you're coming up with a palette. It can be when you're designing a quilt. It can be when you're making the quilt. It can be when you're piecing or quilting. For us, we have a lot of ideas that percolate over a long time that I actually did a quick search on my computer for the word development, because that's what I tend to do when we're working on something that we haven't used. So I have a folder, of development files, and there were 238 development files.
Right.
That many things that we, the cut your losses, we've set it aside. Some of those are half-made quilts. Some of those are half-baked ideas. But
talk about reclaimed.
Oh,
that was such a good. You want me to grab it?
Yeah, sure. So I'll talk about two different quilts really quickly, and this is about cutting losses. I actually think I have a photo here. One of the things earlier on, I'm sorry, I lost who it was saying with their sit-down long arm that they had their first quilt on the wall by them. I think that's a great idea, and I tend we each have our own workspaces and we have a mutual workspace. In my workspace, I always have tons of sketches and illustrations up, and here's a quick illustration that I had up for how many years?
A lot of years.
A lot of years, because I thought there was something here, but it was just never working. It was too many ideas. It was kind of the circles, the hexagons, the sashing, the triangles. And then we had just finished, this was years ago, we finished our printology line, and Weeks looked at my illustration, looked at our fabric and said, wait a minute. And she pulled it all together by looking at it and saying,
yes, Kathy Harvey saw it already, yeah.
Okay, yeah. It's billiards, you get it. So
okay, I'll hold this. So
you hold that, and I, of course, just covered this up. So yeah, for years, it sat around as this. Too many ideas. And edit, going for this analogous palette, getting rid of the sashing, getting rid of the overall hexagon, and it all just came together. And in a very similar way, another sketch I had up for years, and I don't have the initial sketch, but our reclaimed quilt, which is here, I had a sketch up that had 3 times as many pieces.
It was just way too complex. It had a whole bunch of diagonals and chevrons sort of thing.
It had so much going on. And the idea is, if I get it a little closer, is I really wanted to use grunge as the star. It's often used as a background fabric. But I thought, what if you kind of take that weathered look, and if you look at the little black, I don't want to call it sashing, but those gaps, they're not all the same thickness. It's kind of like the drying of barnwood. And I just had way too much going on. Mm-hmm. But I left it up there to just percolate. And then I think many times I said, oh, I really want to do this. And Weeks very rightly pointed out the issues it had. And then I just wanted to make it work, and years after I designed it, it was a gesture of editing and simplification where it came together.
Because we have a rule that we both have to like something before it gets,
Well, we occasionally make our own things also, but if it's something that we're going to publish, or we both have to be on board.
Yeah, but I think one of the, the thing to ask yourself is if your question is, when is it time to cut your losses? If it's not, I just ripped out the quilting on a quilt that I had made, 5 years ago?
We've almost never ripped out
It's like the
quilting.
only time, and I was just kind of like, I was in a hurry.
It was 2 square feet you had started?
Oh my gosh, it took forever to rip out the quilting. It was one of those things that I didn't have time in my day. I was rushing. I wanted to get it done. We had a deadline. And I didn't think it through. And then I paused and I'm like, I don't like it, but I have to finish. And I just kept going. And
then we put that aside for how many years?
That was aside for a couple of years because I was like,
too
I don't want to. It was too painful. And, but, we didn't cut our losses because we still liked the quilt, and we just needed to do that 30 minutes a day. And I literally did spend like 30 minutes a day.
For too many days.
For too many days, but I got it done.
And then we requilted it. And I think part of what was driving that decision was we loved the color and the fabrics, but they weren't available anymore. So if they'd still been available, we might have just scrapped it and remade it. Oh.
This is the quilt. This is by the way, this is in our Art of the Quilt calendar.
Which is just out.
And this is the quilt I spent 2 months ripping out the quilting on. So cut your losses when there's you don't have the time or space in your head, or there's no chance it's going to give you any joy or satisfaction to finish it. Mm-hmm. Totally fine. Then there was a question about being disinterested in finishing after a long wait at the long armor. So she was saying, by the time it gets back from the long armor, I've kind of lost my mojo to binding and finishing it and putting the label on. And I think this comes down to making sure that you have a good space and you have a good setup for doing those things. We do a quick binding. It's on our YouTube channel. We bind a queen size quilt in a half an hour. Oh. And it's very satisfying.
Queen size quilt may take an hour, but it's quick.
Fast. It's fast. And so either consider a different binding technique, or do the half an hour thing where you're just going to work on it for half an hour. But I also think having a motivation to want to use the quilt or give the quilt or whatever. But I can understand it can seem anticlimactic. Sort of like, oh, okay, I'm done. But if you find a binding technique that's easier for you and doesn't involve any handwork, that might also help. And then, let's see, there was the... I'm
glad, Kathy, that you used that method.
Oh, good. It's satisfying to get it done.
We don't do it necessarily because it's faster. I like the method.
We absolutely do it because it's faster.
Oh, I don't always...
We couldn't spend days binding quilts.
No, but there are quilts where we still do it by hand occasionally because it's part of the design, but for me, a lot of it is I just don't enjoy hand binding quilts, and some people do. Yeah. So that's... But it's also... It's nice and fast.
Time. Yeah.
It's nice and fast.
Time. But... So you're going to explain to them Art of the Quilt calendar?
Oh, the Art of the Quilt calendar, we have been doing an annual wall calendar for years.
Yeah.
Now, and the 2024 one is just out. If you look on Facebook, there is a post that has a link where you can purchase it. As always, it has
the link.
Yeah, if you go to our website, you'll get a link. Yes. So there are 12 quilts. The patterns are included, and we work with our partners at Willow Creek, which they've been great to work with. They're in Wisconsin. And they always do like a very nice job. Plus, they're nice to work with. Nice people.
Now, I will say this, because we sometimes have this issue. When you buy the patterns, when you buy the calendar, the patterns are in the back envelope, in a pocket, and they are loose. What happens to them after you purchase that, and how you organize them to make sure you don't lose them? That's part of your purchase transaction. We get a lot of people who email or call and say, "Oh, I lost that one part
from 5 years ago.
Can you send it to me?" And it's like, no, we can't do that.
You got it.
So be sure that you figure out how you're going to store or organize those pattern pieces, because they have a way of getting lost in people's houses or misplaced or
the
whatever.
nice thing is it has a really nice built-in pocket in the back, but when you take them out to make a quilt in your studio, either make sure you put them back or organize them.
So Mei Chow, I'm glad that you were able to use the tutorial for learning how to bind your quilts more quickly. It really makes a big difference. And as we've said before, a lot of quilt show judges do not like that method. And so if you plan to submit it for a quilt show, be aware of that.
Because you see the stitching.
Yeah, you see the stitching. But that's also something that there's a little bit of a learning curve to that. So starting on placemats, starting on charity quilts, be the person in your guild who offers to bind some charity quilts or whatever.
That's a great way to get practice.
That's a great way to practice. Everything is practice. So, just kind of give yourself that ability to learn and be a beginner, and celebrate learning and improving, and don't assume. Like, I heard somebody who's very well known in the quilting world say once, I really want to learn how to do machine embroidery, but I really want to be good at it. Like from the get-go.
Get in line.
I thought, come on, don't say that. Because that's, it's encouraging to allow people to, let's all celebrate learning and doing something new,
Absolutely.
So
we have time for one last.
Yes. And
okay.
I think we already covered that one.
Great.
So I think sort of the general how to get unstuck is to break up the time, start small,
make space,
and
literally and figuratively,
and be forgiving of yourself as you learn and work to improve your skills. Those of you kind of quick summer camp.
No spoilers.
Yes. The progress is looking great for those of you who have moved to the installment 6 cabin, where people can share their finished quilts. We're getting so many people who are just starting. There's lots of
5 minutes before we started this.
Yeah, there was a bunch of people who just downloaded the pattern. If you got the pattern early, please print out everything. Print out your welcome letter, because we get a lot of requests to resend links. And will you explain for people what they need to do to make sure they have what they need, and the downloads issue?
With any downloaded pattern, you get a link, and that link will expire in a given time, whether it's 30 days or 60 days, whatever the pattern says. Make sure you download the pattern in that time. You can save that PDF. It's yours forever. So it's just that the link to get it has an expiry date on it. So you just want to make sure that you don't make the purchase and think 4 months later, oh, I never downloaded that.
But what I was trying to get at was we've had dozens and dozens of people who are, to access the lodge, they're going back to their original receipt, and they're trying to click on the receipt to get access to the lodge. And then then they send an email saying but I haven't, I can't download it. And Bill can check, and he's like, she's downloaded it 14 times. So she's definitely got it. So look in your downloads
for the welcome letter
and the address is on the welcome letter. So there were a lot of people who were traveling earlier in the summer, bought the pattern on June 1st, and are now realizing that
Just getting to
that
it.
original receipt, the link, expired. However,
But that's different from if you have the welcome letter, that's all you need.
but there are lots of people who are saying, I didn't print out the welcome letter, but I'm saying you probably had it in your downloads.
Yes.
So look in your downloads.
And so there's a learning curve for everyone with digital patterns, but in many people don't realize that they have downloaded it. And most devices have a very specific downloads folder. Always check there.
But if you can search for the welcome letter there,
Yes.
then you'd have everything. So, okay. So we are gonna get back to
go
work.
make quilts.
Go make some more fat quarter bundles. We will see you on September 1st, which is our post day for the Summer Camp Modern Mystery Quilt.
So that'll be exciting.
So if you you will be able to post on your personal page, and we will be posting on our pages, and then we will be getting ready. Bill will be planning to give you directions on how to submit your finished quilts for the
exhibition,
the virtual
That's all
exhibition.
to come.
So we have a very exciting month ahead.
Yeah.
Enjoy the rest of your summer, and we will be sharing on September 1st. We'll have our quilt to share with you too, and we look forward
Lots to show you.
Yeah, and do let us know in the comments if there are other topics you'd like us to consider for future Quilts First. We always learn a lot from you too. So
Absolutely, and thanks
take
for all the
care, and
nice.
thanks for all of the nice comments we've received.
All right.